The air tasted of cold rust and deep, settling dust. It was a flavor that coated the back of Leo's throat, thick and metallic, a constant reminder of the monumental emptiness surrounding him. 11 years old, he had chosen the Northbound Terminal as his sanctuary, a monument of abandoned movement frozen in time. Leo huddled in the cavity beneath what used to be the ticket vendor's booth. The wood above him groaned softly under the atmospheric pressure shifts, sounding like the long, mournful exhalation of a forgotten beast. He had dragged 3 threadbare salvaged baggage straps and a collapsed piece of cardboard into the space, creating a meager nest against the polished concrete floor that radiated a relentless, bone-aching chill. His urgency was a constant drumming pulse behind his eyes. He'd been gone for 41 hours. 41 hours since the argument, since the terrible words had been spoken, since the realization had struck him like a physical blow. The world he knew, the small, fragile security he had constructed after his mother's sudden absence 6 months ago, was dissolving. He was nothing but a burden now, a problem to be solved by social workers and sterile, temporary rooms. The thought of that cold, forced displacement drove the blood away from his fingertips, leaving them stiff and useless. He clutched the single, smooth stone he always kept, a river rock, dark grey, perfectly oval, pressing it into his palm until the ridges of his skin were imprinted with its cool permanence. This was his anchor in the chaos. The terminal was massive, a cathedral built for speed and transit. 50 feet above him, the glass panes of the arched roof were fractured, laced with cobwebs, filtering the grey afternoon light into weak, segmented columns. In the silence, every sound was amplified into an assault. The drip, drip, drip of condensation somewhere near the dormant baggage carousel sounded like a metronome counting down the seconds until discovery. The faint, rhythmic clink, clink, clink of expansion and contraction in the steel support beams echoed the frantic beating of his own heart. Leo adjusted the cardboard above him, trying to seal a draft. The smell of decay was strongest here, a mix of mildewed paper, ozone from the defunct power systems, and the faint ghosts of forgotten cigar smoke and cheap coffee that had once defined this place. He hadn't eaten anything substantial since he arrived. Only a half bag of stale pretzels found jammed under a waiting bench near track 4. His stomach was a tight, painful knot, but the fear was a powerful anesthetic, overriding the need for food or sleep. He needed to be invisible. He needed the world to forget he existed, just until he could figure out what came next. The light began to fail, drawing down the curtains of evening. The vast hall, which had been weakly illuminated by the high fractures, began to deepen into oppressive shadow. Leo pulled his knees tight to his chest. The chill intensified immediately upon the departure of the sun, biting through his thin jeans. He reached out a tentative hand, exploring the gritty floor of his enclosure. His fingers navigated the fine layer of dust and dried grit. He was searching for nothing specific, just the tactile reassurance of the ground. His index finger brushed against something impossibly hard and cool, interrupting the even texture of the floor. It wasn't concrete, it wasn't grit, it was metal. He froze, breath held high in his lungs. This was the first time his exploration yielded anything other than trash or debris. Very slowly, deliberately, he curled his fingers around the object and pulled it back into the relative safety of the shadows beneath the booth. He lowered his head, scrutinizing the item in the faint, residual light filtering from the main hall. It was a key, not the small, flimsy kind used for a padlock or a diary. This was substantial. It possessed an impressive weight that felt solid and historical in his small palm. The metal was a dark, aged brass, almost bronze, dulled by decades of oxidation and disuse. He traced the length of the shank. It was thick, almost square in cross-section, tapering slightly toward the bit. The cuts, the teeth of the key, were astonishingly complex. They weren't simple, saw-toothed notches. Instead, they were intricate geometric steps, deep shoulders, and precise, minute indentations, suggesting a mechanism of considerable sophistication. This was not a key meant to unlock a simple box, but it was the head of the key that truly arrested his attention. It was not a common round or square shape. It was an elaborate, heavy loop, sculpted into the stylized image of two intertwined, winged serpents, their mouths meeting at the center point where the shank began. Engraved deeply into the brass, just below the serpents' tails, was a single, authoritative word, scored with a meticulous hand, though now worn smooth by time and thousands of insertions. Master. Leo turned the key over and over. It had a peculiar balance, a centralization of mass that made it feel less like a tool and more like an artifact. How had it survived, laying clean on the floor beneath the heavy debris and years of grime? It felt almost as if it had settled there recently, deliberately waiting. He let the fear of discovery recede slightly, replaced by a consuming, crystalline curiosity. The key demanded attention. It was too important, too beautifully crafted, to belong to something trivial. He knew with the instinctive certainty of a child encountering a focused mystery that this key belonged to the terminal itself. It felt like the core mechanism of the forgotten machine he was currently hiding inside. If it was a master key, what did it unlock? His gaze drifted across the vast, echoing space of the main waiting room. The benches were bolted down, the clock stopped, the windows opaque with dirt. His eyes finally fixed on the bank of lockers. They stood near the southern wall, a monolithic grid of faded green-painted steel, 3 rows high, stretching 20 feet wide. They were relics of an era when travelers entrusted their belongings to these simple, numbered boxes before boarding their long-haul journeys. Most of the tiny keyholes were clogged with dirt or vandalized. Leo hesitated. He knew he shouldn't move. Moving meant exposure. Exposure meant risking the cold, hard logic of the adult world finding him again. But the weight of the key in his hand was an irresistible pull. It felt like a mission assigned directly to him by the silent, judging edifice of the station. He waited another hour, agonizingly slow. The shadows deepened into absolute blackness in the corners of the terminal. He watched the intermittent beam of a distant streetlight penetrate the high windows, sweeping the floor like a lazy searchlight every time a heavy truck passed on the unseen street outside. When the stillness felt absolute, weighted and suffocating, Leo decided. The urgency of the key eclipsed the urgency of his own survival. He slowly, agonizingly slowly, edged out from beneath the booth. The friction of his cheap jacket against the concrete sent a loud, grating shh through the silence. He froze, his entire body rigid, listening desperately for any response. The skittering of a rodent, the settling of steel, anything, nothing. Only the steady drip, drip, drip near the baggage carousel. He stood up, crouching low. The space felt immense and hostile. His legs were stiff and shaky from the prolonged inactivity. He moved, not on his feet, but on the balls of his feet, adopting the unnatural, silent gait of a predator that was also prey. The locker bank was a 30-yard dash away, across the open expanse of the waiting room. Every step he took on the polished concrete sounded impossibly loud to his own ears, like the crunch of gravel underfoot, though it was only the negligible sound of his worn sneakers on the dust. He kept his body pressed low, using the remaining row of long, bolted-down wooden benches as cover. He moved in short, quick bursts, then stopped, holding his breath, adjusting his hearing to the silence, listening for anything that didn't belong. The wind outside seemed to be picking up, whistling a high, thin note through a broken pane somewhere near the tracks. He began his systematic search. The master key in his hand felt like a compass needle pointing toward a specific resonant target. The lockers were numbered in sequence, starting from the far left, 1, 2, 3. He moved past the first 2 rows. Most of the locks looked cheap, mass-produced. They did not match the quality or complexity implied by the master key. Many of the small keyholes were simply empty, having been drilled out or popped open by thieves decades ago. He reached the 3rd uppermost row. He had to stand on the edge of the low concrete ledge that ran along the wall to reach them. The numbers here were higher: 28, 29, 30. His finger, trembling slightly, traced the numbers, feeling the raised paint beneath the sticky grime. 31, 32, and then 33. Locker. 33 looked superficially identical to the others. Same faded green paint, same dimensions. But as Leo peered closely at the mechanism, he saw the subtle difference. The lock assembly on locker 33 was older, heavier. It was not a cheap replacement. It was recessed slightly into the steel door, protected by a thick, circular bezel of solid, dark metal, and the keyhole itself was wider, deeper, with the faint gleam of precision-cut brass visible deep within. It was perfectly clean, as if maintained even in the decades of surrounding neglect. This was the lock built for the key he held. The connection was instantaneous and certain. A physical current seemed to jump from the key in his hand to the brass aperture of the lock. Leo took 3 deliberate shaking breaths, trying to stabilize his heart rate, which was now hammering against his ribs with painful force. This wasn't just curiosity anymore. This was a direct command. He lifted the heavy master key. It seemed to slot into the keyhole with almost zero resistance, sliding deeply into the mechanism until the head of the winged serpents rested flush against the thick bezel. He gripped the head tightly. The cold metal instantly warmed under the heat of his anxiety. Turning the key was the next terrifying step. He braced himself, expecting the screech of rusted tumblers, the loud thunk of an ancient mechanism engaging. Any sharp noise in this profound silence would be catastrophic. He twisted the key counterclockwise, slowly, exerting only the minimum pressure required. There was no screech, there was no thunk. Instead, the mechanism responded with a sound that was less a noise and more a profound sensation. A silken, deep click. It was the sound of perfect engineering meeting its match, a heavy, decisive sound of alignment, immediately dampened and absorbed by the surrounding metal. The lock released. Leo withdrew the master key. He could feel the slight give in the small handle of the locker door. He held his breath one last time, reaching out with his free hand. His fingers curled around the looped handle. He pulled. The door of locker 33 opened, not with a metallic squeal of protesting hinges, but with a smooth, oiled sigh. The heavy steel moved silently, a testament to careful professional maintenance. Leo peered into the resulting cavity. It was not empty. The interior of the locker was small, clean, and dominated by a single object, a rectangular wooden box. It was a cigar box, polished dark mahogany, with dovetail joints visible at the corners. It looked expensive, cared for. There were no labels, no engravings, only the deep, rich sheen of the wood, reflecting the faint ambient light. Leo reached in and lifted the box. It was heavier than he expected, possessing the same satisfying density as the master key. He closed the locker door silently, feeling the lock automatically reset with another soft, perfect snick. He needed light. He needed to be safe again. He retreated, tracing his path meticulously back across the vast floor, moving silently and swiftly along the shadow line of the benches. He slid back into the damp safety of his hideout beneath the ticket booth. Once he was fully concealed, cardboard drawn mostly closed, he rested the wooden box on his knees. His fear had been replaced entirely by a thrilling, high-wire focus. He needed a way to see. His single, most precious piece of inventory was his mother's old key fob, a promotional item from a long-defunct insurance company. It was rectangular and flat, featuring a small, weak LED light. It was his only source of illumination. He fumbled in the interior pocket of his jacket until his fingers found the smooth plastic. He held the key fob directly over the box and pressed the tiny button. A narrow, pale cone of yellow light spilled onto the mahogany surface. There was no latch, no obvious clasp holding the box shut. Leo ran his hands over the smooth wood. His fingers located a slight lip where the lid met the body of the box. He pressed the key fob between his shoulder and cheek, letting the weak light continue its job, and used both hands to carefully lever the lid open. The wood did not creak. It sighed softly, parting cleanly from the box's body. The moment the lid separated, a scent wafted up to him, immediate and overwhelming. It wasn't rust or dust or mildew. It was the scent of home, a perfect blend of old library paper, dried lavender, and the faint, unmistakable residue of his mother's favorite hand lotion, a scent Leo hadn't realized he had forgotten until it flooded his senses, sharp and painfully real. Tears sprang instantly to his eyes, blinding him for a moment. He quickly blinked them away, swallowing the sudden, thick lump of grief that rose in his throat. He directed the light into the box. The contents were neat, organized, and deeply meaningful. The box held 3 items, each resting on a layer of faded purple silk lining. 1, a thick, leather-bound notebook. 2, a small, folded, handwritten letter secured with a piece of twine. 3, a single, heavy object wrapped in a piece of soft grey flannel. Leo reached for the notebook first. The leather was supple, worn smooth by years of handling. He opened the cover. Inside the front flap, written in his mother's elegant, looping hand, a handwriting he instantly recognized, the one that used to leave notes taped to the refrigerator, was the inscription, "To Leo, when the time comes, and only when the master key finds you, find strength in the stillness." Leo's lower lip began to tremble violently. The key hadn't found the locker, it had found him. This was not a random relic. It was an inheritance, a message left specifically for the future iteration of himself, a desperate, lost iteration. He flipped the pages. It wasn't a diary but a ledger. On every page, meticulously logged, were lists of dates and costs. Not large financial sums, but tiny everyday expenditures. Bus fares, $150, milk, $3.25, replacement shoelaces, 079. Each entry was accompanied by a single cryptic code written in the margin. Or. The final entry was dated 6 months and 4 days ago, just 2 days before she died unexpectedly in her sleep. New locksmith fee, $45. He closed the book. It wasn't about money. It was about record-keeping, about stability, about ensuring everything, no matter how small, was accounted for. It was a metaphor for the way his mother had tried to hold their world together. He carefully placed the ledger aside and picked up the folded letter. The twine securing it was familiar, the thin, brown string she used for wrapping Christmas presents. He broke the seal of twine and unfolded the thick, creamy paper. The script was looser here, more emotional, written with a heavier pressure of the pen. The letter was titled simply, "For When You Are Lost." Leo held the key fob closer, the light trembling on the words as his hands shook. "My dearest, brilliant Leo, if you are reading this, it means 2 things are true. I am no longer physically with you, and you have sought refuge in the one place I knew you would go when the world outside became too loud and too confusing. The station, Leo, is not a place of departures. It is a place where everything holds still, just long enough for us to catch our breath. You ran, I know you did. You ran because the grief of my absence, combined with the hard, sharp edges of the new reality you face, became too much to bear. Please know, Leo, that running away is not a failure. Sometimes, finding a safe place to stop the noise is the bravest thing you can do. I knew this day might come. Not because I expected to leave you so soon, God knows I fought every day to stay, but because you are so much like me. When the pressure mounts, we seek the quietest, most forgotten corner. For me, that was always the Northbound Terminal. Even when it was operational, it held a special kind of silence between the thunder of the trains. I began renting Locker 33 many years ago. It wasn't for secrecy, but for perspective. When I felt I was losing control of the chaos of daily life, I would come here. I would open this locker and look at the contents, and I would remember the anchor points. I kept the master key polished and the lock oiled because this location was my truth. The world will try to tell you that you are unstable, that you are a child defined by a deficit, by the loss of your mother. They will see your vulnerability as a weakness, Leo. But you must never believe that. You must look at the ledger. That notebook holds the true secret of Locker 33. It is not a financial record. It is a record of consistency. It proves that even in the greatest periods of scarcity and pain, we maintained structure, we maintained discipline, and we always kept a precise account of where we stood. We were not rich, but we were fundamentally stable. The chaos you feel now is external, Leo, imposed by external tragedy. It is not inherent to you. You were always my stable point. You were the reason I kept the ledger clean, the reason I kept the master key safe. I wanted you to know that the ability to keep moving is built upon the foundation of knowing exactly where you are standing right now. The world wants you to move forward immediately, to jump on the next track, but you have permission here to stop. You must use this time in the silence of the station, where nothing is moving, to find the true, quiet rhythm of your own heart again. I love you, my boy. Find the strength in the stillness. It is always there. Your mother, Eleanor. Leo finished reading the letter. The weak yellow light caught the single dark, dried spot near the signature, where his mother's own tears must have fallen years ago when she wrote it. He did not cry immediately. The grief was too vast, too absolute to be contained by tears. Instead, the profound sense of connection that surged through him felt like a physical shock. He was not alone. He had never been truly alone. His mother had anticipated this very moment of crisis, this exact need for a quiet harbor. He folded the letter with meticulous care, pressing the creases flat with the side of his thumb, reverently returning it to the box. Now only the third item remained, the object wrapped in grey flannel. He lifted the small bundle. It was heavy, concentrated weight, cold through the soft cloth. He peeled back the fabric slowly. It was a piece of track, not a large section, but a small, heavy slice of railroad track, cut perhaps 6 inches long, polished entirely smooth and highly reflective. It was dense iron, cold and inert, yet vibrating with unspoken symbolism. Etched into the surface of the iron, not cut, but seemingly pressed or forged, was the single word: anchor. It was the final piece of the legacy. The constant, immovable weight. The truth that even when everything else was moving at high speed, the trains, the world, the people, there was a fundamental, heavy truth that held steady. Leo sat back on his heels in the dark, smelling the phantom scent of lavender and dust. The cold of the concrete was irrelevant now. The emptiness of the terminal was no longer threatening. It was protective. He held the segment of track in one hand, the master key in the other. He spent a long time, maybe an hour, just feeling the weight of the objects, cycling through the emotions that rolled over him in waves. The sharp, stabbing pain of loss, the sudden, profound understanding, and the quiet, spreading warmth of being utterly seen and loved by someone who was no longer there. He realized the severity of his current situation. The hunger, the cold, the risk of discovery had not diminished, but his perspective had radically changed. The urgency was no longer born of blind panic. It was now focused, driven by a new understanding of his own structure. He had run away from chaos, and his mother had led him to an anchor in the middle of it. He carefully closed the mahogany box, returning the master key to the inside, and slid it back into Locker 33. He locked it again, hearing that perfect silken click. He didn't need to hold the objects. The knowledge of their existence and the weight of the segment of track now tucked deep into his inside jacket pocket was enough. He had been planning his next move. Maybe try to hop a freight train south, maybe disappear entirely into the anonymity of the larger city. All plans fueled by panic and lack of structure. Now he read the ledger again in the pale light. He read the final line, new locksmith fee, 45 zeros. The Northbound Terminal, locker 33, a place of maintenance and stability, not escape. Leo knew with a fresh clarity what he had to do. He couldn't stay here forever. The station was a temporary stop, not a destination. He had to go back, not to surrender, but to negotiate, to assert the stability he now knew he possessed. The thought of going back into the world where he faced foster care, social workers, and the overwhelming confusion of his family members, was terrifying. But now, it was a terrifying task, not a terrifying flight. He waited for the deepest part of the night. His bladder was aching, his stomach cramping, but his mind was strangely clear. The constant, hammering urgency that had plagued him for 2 days was replaced by a steady, deep rhythm, the rhythm of the anchor. He watched the clock near the track doors. It was stopped at 3:17. He looked at his mother's cheap plastic watch, still functioning, strapped to his wrist. 1:45 a.m. He had to move before dawn, before the local patrols made their slow, early rounds. He decided to use the station's geography to his advantage. He would exit through the low, disused freight tunnel that led into the city drainage system, a route he had discovered earlier in his panicked explorations. He stood up, stretching his cramped muscles. The track segment in his pocket provided a comforting, dense weight. Leo took a moment, looking around the cavernous space. The high arches, the dust-filled columns of light, the forgotten tracks stretching out into the darkness. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered into the profound silence. He moved toward the back of the terminal, toward the doors leading to the loading bay. This area was darker, more dangerous, piled high with decades of broken furniture, industrial detritus, and heavy tarps. He had to navigate a field of broken glass and rusted steel frames. He held the key fob light low, illuminating only the ground immediately in front of his feet. The metallic stench here was mixed with the sharp odor of coolant and decaying rubber. He heard the scuttling of something large near a pile of old rail ties. He froze, listening. It was probably a large rat, but in the silence, it sounded like the scraping of a large boot. His panic threatened to rise, but he consciously pressed the smooth riverstone in his palm, feeling the weight of the track segment against his hip. Anchor. Stability. He reached the heavy corrugated steel door leading to the old freight passage. It was rusted shut, secured by a long, heavy chain wrapped through the handles. Leo had known this was his only option out, and he had examined the chain the day before. It wasn't padlocked, just tightly cinched. He spent 10 concentrated minutes working the heavy, cold links, ignoring the persistent ache in his hands. He used the flat end of the master key, which he had retrieved, to lever one of the stubborn links open just enough. He pulled the large steel door open just enough to slide through the gap. The metal shrieked a high-pitched, terrifying sound that seemed to carry for miles in the cold night air. He slipped through quickly, letting the door fall back into place with a muffled thud. He was in the passage. It was cold, damp, and smelled strongly of saturated earth and wet concrete. The master key was back in his hand, ready to be returned to locker 33 after he was safely gone. The tunnel led downward, slick with condensation and moss, toward the distant, unseen roar of the city's drainage outflow. The sound of running water, thick and heavy, was the first constant noise he had heard in 2 days, a deafening sound compared to the station's silence. He stumbled on a piece of broken concrete, scraping his knee. He felt the hot sting of blood welling up beneath the tear in his pants. He didn't stop. He pushed forward, driven by the absolute necessity of reaching the street before the city woke. The tunnel was long, winding, and completely dark. He navigated by the diminishing echoes of the terminal behind him and the increasing rush of water ahead. He used the master key fob light sparingly, saving the battery life. After what felt like an hour of scrambling, he saw the faint, diffused light of the distant tunnel mouth. He was approaching the city boundary. He climbed out of the drainage grate onto a low-traffic alleyway near the edge of the industrial district. The air here was different, less sterile, thick with the smell of exhaust fumes and commercial waste. But it was moving air, not the trapped, stagnant atmosphere of the station. He emerged onto the pavement, his clothes filthy, his face streaked with grime, his eyes wide and adjusted to the deep dark. He stood there for a long time, simply breathing the harsh, free air. He had his mother's letter in his pocket. He had the master key. He had the weight of the anchor. He started walking. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that he was heading toward the familiar cluster of streets where his old house stood, the house he had fled 2 days ago, convinced he would never return. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a thin, sickly wash of pale orange fighting the deep blue of night. The walk was grueling. His legs ached, his head pounded with hunger, and the cold had settled deep into his chest. But every step was deliberate, measured. He repeated the words from the letter in his mind. Find strength in the stillness. He thought about the master key. It was an instrument of access, but his mother had used it as an instrument of control, a tangible representation of her ability to manage the small, crucial aspects of her life. He realized he was carrying that control now. When he reached the street, he recognized his heart hammered again, but this time it was not pure terror. It was anticipatory anxiety, mingled with a quiet, fierce resolve. His house looked small and terribly normal in the pre-dawn light. The curtains were drawn. The single oak tree in the front yard looked exactly the same. He approached the porch slowly. He saw the brightly colored paper taped to the front window, easily visible even in the gloom. It was a missing person poster. His face, slightly blurred, stared back at him, missing Leo S., age 11. The sight of it was a punch to the gut. The consequences were real. He didn't use the front door. He walked around to the back, toward the small kitchen entrance. He didn't need to knock. He simply needed to be seen. He stepped onto the porch. The floorboards creaked loudly under his weight. Instantly, the kitchen light flickered on. The door flew open. Standing in the threshold was his Aunt Carol, the woman who had reluctantly taken him in after his mother's death, the woman with whom he had exchanged the terrible words that led to his flight. Aunt Carol looked completely broken. Her hair was messy, her eyes wide, ringed with exhaustion and worry. She was wearing a bathrobe and holding a mug of coffee that she instantly dropped, sending a loud, shattering crash across the porch. She didn't shout. She just stared at him, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Leo stood straight. He was shaking from cold and exhaustion, but he held himself steady, focusing on the weight of the anchor in his pocket. "Leo," she whispered, the sound thin and ragged. "Oh my God, Leo." She rushed forward, not in anger, but in a panicked, desperate embrace. She gripped him so tightly that it hurt, burying her face in his filthy hair, sobbing violently. I thought you were dead. I called everyone, the police. Oh, Leo, I was so wrong. I was so angry, and I didn't mean any of it," she choked out, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Leo didn't hug her back right away. He waited, letting the intense, urgent wave of her relief wash over him. He felt the physical pressure of her remorse. When she finally pulled back, holding his face in her shaking hands, her expression was one of absolute, raw vulnerability. "I said terrible things," she whispered, "about being too much trouble, about how I couldn't handle it. Leo, I can't handle it, but I need you here. I didn't mean I didn't want you." Leo looked directly into her eyes. He didn't need to defend himself or blame her. He needed to state his truth, the truth he had found in the stillness. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the piece of heavy, polished track, the anchor. He placed it carefully into her hand. "I found this," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, though hoarse from thirst. "I went to the Northbound Terminal. Mom left it for me." Aunt Carol stared at the heavy metal in her palm. It was cold, dense, and incomprehensible. "She used to go there when things got hard," Leo continued. "She said you have to find the anchor point, not run away from the problem, but know where you stand." He looked at the wreckage of the coffee mug, the spilled brown liquid staining the wooden porch. "I know it's hard for you," Leo said. "I know I'm a disruption. But I'm not going to be chaos, I will be stability. Just tell me what needs to be fixed and I will keep a record, Aunt Carol. We can be stable together." He didn't use complicated language. He used the language of the ledger and the anchor. He presented himself not as a frightened child running away, but as a person returning with a foundation. Aunt Carol looked down at the track segment, then back at his face, seeing the profound, desperate maturity that had settled over him in the darkness of the terminal. She understood, not the specifics of the key and the locker, but the weight of the realization he had carried back. "Oh, sweetheart," she breathed, pulling him back into a gentle, non-panicked embrace this time. "Let's go inside. You are freezing, and you need food. We will start over, Leo. We will figure out where we stand together." Leo leaned into her. The cold, frantic urgency that had driven him for 2 days finally, definitively, receded. He was home. He was seen. He was anchored. He knew that the challenges were not over. The grief would remain. The new reality of his life with Aunt Carol would be difficult, and the fear of instability would always linger, a deep scar. But he had the master key, hidden in locker 33, waiting for the next time the world felt too loud. He had the letter, memorized. He had the anchor, now shared. And he realized that the secret of locker 33 wasn't about a forgotten treasure or a hidden escape route. The secret was that stability is not found in standing still, but in knowing precisely what heavy, immovable thing you are carrying when you move forward. And Leo knew. He had found his anchor. He closed his eyes, inhaling the scent of coffee and Aunt Carol's faded laundry detergent. He was tired, bone-deep and aching, but the exhaustion was clean. He was safe. He was home. The journey had ended, and the life could finally begin again, anchored in the stillness of the forgotten terminal.